For 6 seasons and 180 episodes. William Frawley sat across from Lucille Ball on the Desilu soundstage and delivered lines that made 50 million Americans laugh every week. He was reliable. He was professionally competent in the specific way of someone who had been working in show business since vaudeville and had survived long enough to develop the kind of timing that cannot be taught. He showed up. He said his lines. He hit his marks. Lucille Ball despised him. Not the casual professional dislike that develops when two people with different working styles are required to occupy the same space for years. The real kind. The kind that she maintained with a consistency across 6 years of daily proximity that the people around her described, when they finally spoke about it decades later, as something they had never seen quite matched in the history of the medium. The public received Fred and Ethel Mertz as television's most lovably bickering couple. The bickering was real. It had simply migrated from the characters to the people playing them. Lucille Ball was born on August 6, 1911 in Jamestown, New York, the daughter of Henry Durrell Ball, an industrial laborer who died of typhoid when Lucille was 3 years old, and Desiree Hunt, who subsequently married a man named Ed Peterson and relocated the family in ways that left Lucille spending substantial portions of her childhood with her maternal grandparents. The specific texture of that childhood, the early loss of the father, the subsequent displacement, the dependence on grandparents who were loving but belonged to a different generation, produced in Lucille Ball a quality of self-determination that expressed itself from the earliest available moment. She decided to be an entertainer before she had any particular evidence that she could be. She enrolled in the John Murray Anderson School of Drama in New York at 15, where she was told by instructors that she had no talent and should consider returning home. She returned to Jamestown briefly and immediately began taking any local performance work available. She came back to New York. She modeled. She worked under the name Diane Belmont to protect the family from the specific embarrassment that a failed acting career tends to produce among people who advised against it. She was cast as a showgirl in various capacities, moved to Hollywood in the early 1930s, and spent a decade in the specific professional middle distance that the studio system maintained for attractive women who could work but had not yet been given the vehicle that would make them stars. RKO put her in films. She appeared opposite Fred Astaire in Follow the Fleet in 1936. She worked consistently and without the breakthrough that should have come earlier, held back by a studio system that had decided she was a B-picture asset and was not inclined to revise the assessment without evidence that the revision would pay. The evidence arrived on the radio. Her 1948 work on the CBS radio program, My Favorite Husband, demonstrated something that the film work had not yet revealed, which was that Lucille Ball, in a comedic format that relied on voice and timing rather than appearance, was a different and considerably more formidable instrument than any of her previous work had suggested. CBS wanted to move the radio program to television. Lucille wanted her husband in it. Desi Arnaz was Cuban. The network's research department had concerns about whether American television audiences would accept a Cuban husband as the romantic partner of a white American woman. These concerns were presented to Lucille and Desi as a practical obstacle. They received the obstacle as an opportunity and took the program on a live tour to demonstrate that audiences accepted the marriage without difficulty. They were correct. CBS capitulated. I Love Lucy premiered on October 15, 1951. The show was produced by Desilu Productions, the company that Lucille and Desi had founded together, which meant that Lucille Ball was not simply the lead actress of one of the most watched programs in American television history. She was also its executive producer, its primary creative authority, and a co-owner of the business entity that was generating the commercial returns that CBS was rapidly discovering were unlike anything the medium had previously produced. She was in 1951 one of the most powerful people in American entertainment. She was also a woman in an era when the industry had a very precise idea of what women with that level of power were supposed to look and sound like, and Lucille Ball spent 20 years demonstrating that the idea was wrong. She cast Vivian Vance as Ethel Mertz after seeing her in a production at the La Jolla Playhouse in California. The casting was instinctive and correct. Vance had the specific quality of grounded reactive intelligence that Lucy's physical comedy required as a foil, a performer who could play the skeptic with genuine conviction rather than performing skepticism while telegraphing to the audience that she was in on the joke. The chemistry that resulted was immediate and genuine, generating a friendship between the two women that survived multiple professional separations and lasted until Vance's death in 1979. The casting of William Frawley as Fred Mertz was different in origin, different in result, and different in almost every dimension that mattered to Lucille Ball. Frawley had telephoned Desi Arnaz directly after hearing about the new show, asking to be considered for a role. He was 64 years old, a veteran of vaudeville radio, and several decades of character work in Hollywood films, and he was honest about his age and his history in the phone call he made. He said he was a hard worker, and he said he knew his lines, and he said he would show up sober. The last point was not incidental. Frawley had a well-documented relationship with alcohol that had cost him professional opportunities for decades, and that was known in the industry with the thoroughness that the industry knows things it has observed across 30 years. Lucille Ball's response to the casting of Frawley is documented in multiple accounts. She did not want him. She believed he was a liability. She believed the drinking would eventually compromise the production. She was overruled, or at least outvoted by Desi and the production team, who had assessed Frawley's proposal and decided that the combination of his experience and his willingness to work for a modest salary made him a practical solution to the Fred Mertz casting problem. She acquiesced. She never forgave anyone for it, including Frawley. William Frawley was born on February 26, 1887 in Burlington, Iowa, into a large Irish Catholic family that he left as soon as he was able, drawn toward vaudeville, with the specific certainty of someone for whom the alternative of staying was less appealing than the uncertainty of going. He performed in vaudeville for years before transitioning to Broadway and then to Hollywood in the 1930s, where his Irish face, his experienced comic timing, and his complete lack of vanity about the kinds of roles he was suited for made him a reliable character actor across dozens of films over 3 decades. He also drank. Not occasionally and not recreationally, but with the systematic regularity of someone for whom alcohol had become the primary organizing principle of his daily existence. He managed the drinking well enough to remain functional, which is a testament to either his constitution or his discipline or both. But the management was a full-time project, and there were occasions when the management failed and the consequences were professional. On I Love Lucy, the management largely held. He knew his lines. He showed up on time more often than his reputation suggested he would. He delivered his Fred Mertz with the crabby put-upon quality that the character required, and the interaction between his Frawley-inflected grumpiness and Vance's Vance-inflected long-suffering produced a comic marriage that the audience found as convincing as they found Lucy and Ricky's romantic one. What the audience did not see was that Vance found the marriage unconvincing for reasons that had nothing to do with the writing. She was in her early 40s when the show began. Frawley was in his mid-60s, bald, and physically represented the specific kind of older man that the Hollywood of the early 1950s had no interest in presenting as the credible romantic partner of an attractive woman in her prime. Vance said so. She said it to people on the set, and she said it to people off the set, and she said it with the directness that the show's success eventually made difficult for anyone to argue against. Frawley's reaction to Vance's comments about his age and appearance was the reaction of a man who had spent 60 years developing a robust ego and was not inclined to absorb criticism about his physical appearance from a woman 20 years his junior. He responded in kind with the specific verbal cruelty of someone who understood that the most efficient attack on a woman in the entertainment industry was an attack on her body. He called her names behind her back and to her face, and in front of crew members who subsequently reported what they had heard. Lucille Ball's position in this dynamic was not that of a neutral party. She was the show's executive producer. She was the person who set the tone of the workplace. She had not wanted Frawley, and his presence on the set was a daily reminder that her professional judgment had been overruled by the people she was otherwise accustomed to having defer to her. Every time Frawley resisted a rehearsal or needed multiple takes because he had not fully absorbed the revisions, or showed up in a condition that was technically functional but was not the fully available professional presence that Lucille Ball required of herself and expected of the people around her, the original objection was confirmed. She was meticulous about her work in a way that people who have not observed genuine comedic craft from the inside often mistake for vanity. But that is actually the opposite. Comedy is the most demanding performance form because it is the one in which failure is immediately and publicly apparent. A dramatic performance that is merely competent can pass. A comic performance that is merely competent is simply not funny. And not funny in front of 50 million people is a catastrophe without gradation. Lucille Ball worked. She rehearsed. She developed her physical comedy with the systematic attention to detail that her grandfather had given her as the primary model of worthwhile human behavior. She required the people around her to bring the same commitment, and Frawley's relationship to rehearsal, which was the relationship of a man who had learned to deliver lines competently across 60 years and saw no particular reason to vary. The approach was not that commitment. She also had specific professional concerns about what would happen if Frawley's drinking ever produced a failure of the kind that his history suggested was possible. Desilu Productions was not a hobby. It was a business. By the mid-1950s, it was one of the most valuable entertainment properties in America. Lucille Ball had built it from nothing with Desi, and the specific vulnerability of having one of its 4 central cast members present a chronic reliability risk was a business concern. She could not set aside simply because the risk had not yet materialized. She addressed the concern in a way that was characteristic of how she addressed professional problems directly and without sentimentality. She had a clause written into Frawley's contract specifying that if he missed 3 consecutive production days due to drinking, he would be terminated. The clause was not subtle. Its insertion was not designed to be subtle. It was a documented statement of the terms of his continued employment and a reminder of who held the power to enforce those terms. I knew about the clause. He said nothing about it publicly while the show was running. He worked around it. He managed himself well enough across the run of I Love Lucy that the clause was never invoked, which is either evidence that the clause served its intended deterrent function, or evidence that his management of the drinking was more reliable than his reputation suggested, or both. When I Love Lucy ended its original run in 1957, the professional relationship between Lucille Ball and William Frawley was complete. She did not work with him again. When CBS later considered a spin-off featuring the Mertz characters, the project was abandoned quickly for reasons that the people involved were not inclined to explain on the record, but that were understood by anyone who had been present for the preceding 6 years. Frawley's final years were spent at his hotel in Hollywood, and in the Desilu-produced Western series My 3 Sons, in which he played a grandfather, a role that suited his age in 1960 in a way that Ethel Mertz's husband had never suited it. I was in those final years, the thing he had always been, a working actor, doing the work with the competence that 6 decades of doing it produced. He had no particular interest in reflection or reconciliation. He did not give interviews in which he addressed the relationship with Lucille Ball. He lived in the hotel he had lived in for years, ate at the same restaurants, maintained the routines that sustained him, and declined to perform regret about anything that had happened in a long professional life that had, by most available measures, gone better than it might have. Howe was walking on Hollywood Boulevard on March 3, 1966, when he had the heart attack that killed him. He was 79 years old. He died in the street he had spent 50 years working on the edges of. It was a death consistent with who he was, public, unmanaged, and entirely his own. Vivian Vance's response, when informed of his death, was reported by people who were present to have been something along the lines of a toast and an expression of genuine relief. Whether the precise words attributed to her were exactly what she said is the kind of question that posterity cannot answer with certainty, but that the people who knew her found consistent with her attitude toward the man. Lucille Ball's public statement about Frawley's death was correct and brief, and contained nothing that could be read as grief. She died on April 26, 1989, of an acute aortic aneurysm 2 weeks after undergoing open-heart surgery. She was 77 years old. Desi Arnaz had died the previous December. Vivian Vance had died a decade earlier. The 4 people whose professional relationship had produced one of the most enduring artifacts in American television history were all gone. What they had built together outlasted all of them, in the specific way that genuinely funny things outlast the people who made them. Because laughter is not historical. It does not require context. A woman stuffing chocolates into her blouse at a conveyor belt is funny in 1952, and it is funny now, and the fact that the woman doing it despised one of the people in the room with her and had specific contractual language drafted to manage the risk he represented does not make it less funny. It perhaps makes it more honest. The mystery of why Lucille Ball hated William Frawley is not actually a mystery. It is a professional assessment confirmed daily across 6 years of evidence made by the most powerful woman in American television about a man whose habits she had identified correctly, whose limitations she had identified correctly, and whose presence on her set she had been required to accept over her explicit objection. She was right about him. She knew she was right. She did not let the knowledge stop the work. That, more than the fact of the hatred, is the thing about Lucille Ball that continues to require examination. She made the most successful comedy in the history of American television while working with someone she could not stand, and the television contains no evidence of the difficulty. That is what she was. That is what the mystery was always about. The I Love Lucy that exists in syndication, watched by people who were not born when it first aired, watched in countries whose languages it has been dubbed into, watched on devices that did not exist in 1951, contains no evidence of any of this. It contains only the comedy, which works as well now as it did then, because it was built with the thoroughness that Lucille Ball applied to everything she built. The Chocolate Factory, the stomping of the grapes, the Vitamita Vegamin audition. 50 minutes of the most precisely constructed physical comedy that American television has produced. Built partly in a room with a man she could not stand, whose presence she had been required to accept, whose habits she had documented in contractual language, and whose death she did not mourn. The mystery is solved. The solution is that it was never a mystery about hatred. It was a mystery about professionalism, about what it looks like when someone decides that the work is more important than the working conditions, about the specific discipline of building something excellent in circumstances that are not excellent with people who are not ideal under constraints that were not chosen.